Imagine standing in a field at dawn, 70 pounds of iron and leather strapped to your body, 20,000 men breathing in unison around you, and an enemy army screaming across the horizon. You are not afraid. You have been forged. You are a Roman legionary, and the world is about to learn exactly what that means. For over 1,000 years, the Roman legionary stood as the most formidable soldier the ancient world had ever produced. Not because Rome bred giants or gods, but because it built a machine, a living, breathing war machine made of flesh and iron, discipline and ingenuity, courage and cold calculation. Today, we are pulling back the curtain on that machine. We are going beyond the Hollywood armor and the epic film battles and diving deep into the real, raw, astonishing truth of what it meant to be a legionary of Rome. 100 facts. 100 windows into a world that shaped all of Western civilization. Some of these will surprise you. Some will shock you. Some will make you wonder how any human being endured it. All of them are real. So settle in, because this is going to be a long march, and every step is worth it. There was a moment in the life of every Roman legionary that changed him forever, and it happened before he ever held a sword in battle. It happened at the oath. When a man enlisted in the Roman legion, he was required to swear the sacramentum, a military oath of absolute loyalty to Rome, to the emperor, and to his commanding officers. This was not a casual promise or a bureaucratic formality. To the Roman mind, this oath was sacred. Breaking it was not merely treason, it was a spiritual crime that condemned a man's soul. The legionary swore to obey all commands without question, to endure all hardships without complaint, and to give his life if Rome required it. What made the sacramentum particularly powerful was that it was renewed every year. On the 1st of January, the entire legion would gather and collectively renew their vows. Imagine 20,000 men standing in formation under a winter sky, voices rising together in one thunderous declaration of loyalty. It was not just military procedure. It was the moment when individual men became something larger than themselves. The oath was the foundation upon which everything else was built. Without it, the legion was nothing. With it, it was unstoppable. The Roman legionary was not born into his role. He was made, and that making began with a brutal selection process that would eliminate the weak before training ever started. Recruitment officers, known as Legionaries, traveled throughout the empire seeking men who met very specific physical criteria. A recruit had to be at least 5 Roman feet 5 inches tall, roughly 5'7" by modern standards, which was actually above average for the ancient world. He needed to be physically fit, with strong limbs, a broad chest, and sharp eyes. He had to be a Roman citizen, or at least a free man from a Romanized province. But perhaps most importantly, he had to be young. Between the ages of 17 and 23 was ideal, though some sources suggest men as old as 35 were occasionally accepted in times of desperate need. Once accepted, the new recruit was not yet a soldier. He was a tyro, a beginner, and he would spend months being evaluated, trained, and broken down before being considered worthy of the title legionary. The selection itself was designed to weed out those who would falter. Rome did not want soldiers. Rome wanted warriors who could think, build, march, and kill with equal efficiency. Before a Roman legionary ever touched a real weapon in combat training, he spent weeks doing something that might seem almost absurd to a modern observer. He learned to march. Not just walk, but march. The Roman military march was a precisely calibrated physical achievement. A legion was expected to cover at least 20 Roman miles per day, roughly 18 modern miles, in full kit, which could weigh anywhere between 60 and 85 pounds when you included armor, weapons, tools, and rations. On forced marches, that distance could stretch to 30 miles or more. The milites, the soldiers, were expected to maintain this pace day after day, across mountains, through forests, and over rivers. To build this endurance, recruits began with lighter loads and shorter distances, gradually increasing over months until full combat kit marching became second nature. Centurions would walk alongside the columns, watching for stragglers, checking posture, evaluating who had the spirit and who was already broken. Marching was not just transportation, it was discipline made physical. It was the daily reminder that your body was no longer your own. It belonged to Rome. and Rome would work it until there was nothing left but iron will. The training sword of the Roman recruit was a fascinating piece of psychological engineering as much as it was a physical tool. Known as the Rudis, this wooden training weapon was deliberately made heavier than a real sword, often twice the weight of an actual gladius. The Romans understood something about muscle memory and strength building that seems remarkably modern. If you train with something heavier than what you will use in battle, the real weapon will feel light in your hands when the moment comes. But the Rudis was more than just a weighted training aid. It was also a symbol. When a gladiator was granted his freedom, he was given a wooden sword, the same Rudis, as a token of his liberation. And when a legionary completed his service after 25 years, the symbolism of that wooden weapon carried cultural weight throughout Roman society. Recruits training with the Rudis did not just learn how to swing a sword. They learned to strike at specific targets on a wooden post called the paulus, aiming for the throat, the groin, the armpit, the places where armor was weakest. They were taught that a slash wound, while dramatic, was far less lethal than a precise thrust. Rome trained killers, not performers. The Roman legion's obsession with the thrust over the slash is one of the most tactically significant decisions in military history, and it deserves to be fully appreciated. When most people imagine sword combat, they imagine dramatic slashing blows, wide arcs of steel cutting through the air. The Romans looked at that style of fighting and considered it almost amateurish. The gladius hispaniensis, the short stabbing sword that became the legionary's signature weapon, was specifically designed for close-quarters thrusting. It was typically around 20 to 24 inches long with a double-edged blade that tapered to a sharp point. In the crush of battle, where men were pressed together so tightly they could smell each other's breath, a long slashing sword was nearly useless. You couldn't draw it back far enough to build momentum. But a short, rigid thrusting sword? You could drive it forward with your body weight and core strength, find the gaps in armor, puncture vital organs, and withdraw it before your enemy's muscles even registered the wound. Roman training manuals, as preserved through later military writers like Vegetius, emphasized that a 2-inch penetrating wound to a vital area was almost always fatal. A slash, even a deep one, might not stop a determined enemy immediately. A thrust to the right place would. The shield of the Roman legionary, the scutum, was one of the most sophisticated pieces of military engineering in the ancient world, and most people look at it and see nothing more than a large wooden board. In reality, the scutum was a carefully constructed composite item, typically made from strips of wood glued together in layers with the grain running in alternating directions, essentially an ancient form of plywood. This gave it remarkable resistance to splitting and cracking under impact. The surface was covered in linen or leather and painted with the unit's distinctive markings and symbols. At the center was an iron boss, the umbo, which was not merely decorative. The boss was a weapon in itself. Legionaries were trained to punch forward with the shield in close combat, driving the iron boss into an opponent's face, chest, or arm with enough force to break bones, stagger opponents, and create the split second of vulnerability needed to deliver a killing thrust. The scutum's curved rectangular shape, roughly 4 feet tall and 2.5 feet wide, was designed to cover the legionary from chin to shin when crouched, and when soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, their overlapping shields created a nearly impenetrable wall. The scutum was not just protection. It was the first weapon you hit the enemy with. The Pilum, the Roman heavy javelin, is one of the most brilliantly designed weapons in military history, and its genius lies not just in what it could do to a human body, but in what it could do to an enemy's equipment. The pilum consisted of a wooden shaft topped with a long iron shank, which in turn ended in a small, hardened pyramidal point. The total length was around 6 to 7 feet. When thrown at close range, typically from about 15 to 20 meters just before a charge, the pilum's narrow iron point could punch through a shield and still have enough momentum to wound the man behind it. But here is where the Roman engineering brilliance truly reveals itself. The iron shank was deliberately designed to bend on impact. Once a pilum had buried itself in a shield, its bent shaft made it nearly impossible to pull out. The enemy was left with a choice: fight with a 6-foot iron-weighted encumbrance dangling from his shield, or drop the shield entirely. Either way, he was now dangerously exposed just as thousands of Roman soldiers came crashing into him at a run. Some historians believe the Romans even deliberately annealed, softened, the iron shank to ensure it would deform predictably. The Pilum was not just a weapon. It was the opening move of a carefully scripted sequence of destruction. One of the least glamorous but most critical aspects of Roman military life was something that almost never makes it into films or popular history: the daily construction of a fortified camp. Every single night on the march, regardless of how exhausted the men were, regardless of whether they were in friendly or hostile territory, a Roman legion was required to build a castra, a marching camp, from scratch. This was not a loose collection of tents. It was a fully fortified military installation, complete with a perimeter ditch, an earthen rampart topped with a wooden palisade, 4 gates, internal road grids, designated areas for tents, latrines, the commanding general's headquarters, the praetorium, and even spaces for the pack animals. The entire structure could be completed in under 3 hours by an experienced legion. Every soldier carried 3 or 4 sharpened stakes as part of his standard kit specifically for this purpose. The camp was always laid out in the same orientation, with the same internal divisions, so that any legionary from any unit could navigate it in the dark, half asleep, without thinking. That standardization was intentional. In an emergency night attack, a panicking soldier who knows exactly where everything is becomes a far more effective defender than one fumbling in confusion. Roman legionaries were not merely soldiers in the modern sense. They were engineers of an almost incomprehensible breadth of capability, and the road system they constructed remains one of the most tangible legacies of their existence. Roman military roads were built to last, and the process of constructing them was as methodical as everything else the legion did. First, surveyors would lay out the straightest possible route between 2 points, using a tool called a groma, a cross-shaped instrument that allowed them to sight perfectly straight lines across terrain. Then soldiers would dig down to solid substrate, sometimes 4 or 5 feet deep, and fill the trench with layers of rubite, gravel, sand, and finally large flat stones on top, carefully cambered, angled, at the sides to allow rainwater to drain away. At their peak, Roman roads stretched over 50,000 miles through the empire. They could move a legion from one end of a province to the other in days rather than weeks. The famous saying that all roads lead to Rome is not merely poetic, it was a logistical reality. The road network was so efficient that it remained the primary transportation infrastructure of Europe well into the medieval period, and portions of it are still in use today. The Roman centurion was the beating heart of the legion, and understanding this officer means understanding the entire Roman military system. A centurion commanded a unit of 80 men, despite the name, which derives from the word for 100, and he was typically not an aristocrat or a political appointment, but a man who had risen through the ranks on the basis of demonstrated ability, courage, and leadership. He was recognizable on the battlefield by several distinctive features. He wore his transverse crest, the plume on his helmet, running sideways across the top rather than front to back like a common soldier's. He wore his decorations on his chest plate on the right side rather than the left, and he carried a vine staff, the vitus, which was both a symbol of authority and a very real disciplinary instrument he did not hesitate to use on soldiers who displeased him. The centurion was expected to lead from the front, literally. He stood at the right side of his century's front rank during battle, the most exposed and dangerous position. The casualty rate among centurions was staggeringly high compared to ordinary soldiers. They were the ones who stepped forward first, who held the line when it was breaking, who by their physical presence communicated to their men that retreat was simply not an option. The psychological preparation of a Roman legionary was as sophisticated as his physical training, and the Romans understood something that modern military psychologists would recognize immediately: fear is not the enemy of a warrior, uncontrolled fear is. Controlled fear, redirected into aggression and determination, is a combat multiplier. Roman training was deliberately designed to expose recruits to terrifying scenarios in controlled environments so that when they faced them in reality, the body's fear response was tempered by familiarity. War games between units were conducted with full intensity, men were genuinely hurt, bones were broken, and those who flinched or ran were publicly humiliated. The Roman military also used music extensively. The cornicin and tubicin, musicians who played curved and straight brass instruments respectively, communicated commands across the chaos of battle. The sound of these instruments, trained into a soldier's nervous system through thousands of repetitions, could cut through the roar of combat and trigger automatic, disciplined responses even in men who were otherwise overwhelmed with fear. When the trumpet sounded a specific call, the body moved before the mind had time to be afraid. That was the point. Rome didn't want men who weren't afraid. It wanted men whose fear had been harnessed and made useful. The Roman practice of decimation is one of the most chilling examples of military discipline in all of human history, and its very name has entered our language, though most people who use the word today have no idea of its horrifying origin. Decimation was a punishment reserved for units that had shown extreme cowardice in battle, soldiers who had fled from the enemy, surrendered without cause, or mutinied against their officers. When a unit was sentenced to decimation, the men were divided into groups of 10 and each group drew lots. The one man in 10 who drew the fatal lot was then beaten to death, not by the enemy, not by executioners, but by the other 9 men in his group, using clubs and stones. Those 9 survivors then had to live with what they had done and live under the stigma of having belonged to a decimated unit. They were sometimes denied their normal rations and forced to sleep outside the camp walls, exposed to the elements. The genius, if you can call it that, of decimation was its mathematical coldness. An innocent man might die. A guilty man might survive. But the collective terror it created in a unit was total. No soldier who had seen or even heard of a decimation ever needed to be told twice to hold his ground in battle. Beyond the terror of decimation, the Roman legionary existed in a daily environment of formal punishment and reward that shaped behavior with extraordinary precision. Lesser offenses, falling asleep on guard duty, losing your equipment, failing a drill inspection, were punished with flogging, reduced rations, demotion in pay grade, or being assigned the most degrading camp tasks such as cleaning latrines. But the system was not merely punitive. It was also one of the most elaborate reward systems in the ancient military world. Soldiers who distinguished themselves in battle could receive dona militaria, military decorations, that ranged from torques and bracelets to falleri, which were embossed metal discs worn on a harness over the chest armor. The highest individual award was the Corona Civica, the civic crown, a simple wreath of oak leaves given to a soldier who had saved the life of a fellow Roman citizen in battle. Despite its humble appearance, the Corona Civica was considered one of the greatest honors a Roman could receive. Even senators were required to rise when a holder of the civic crown entered a room. For men who came from poverty, from the edges of the empire, from nothing, these decorations were transformative. They were proof that a man had mattered. The question of what Roman legionaries actually ate is one that has fascinated historians for generations, and the answer is both surprising in its sophistication and sobering in its monotony. The basic ration of a Roman soldier was fermentum, grain, typically wheat, which the soldier was expected to grind himself and bake into a flat bread or porridge called pulse. Each soldier received a daily grain ration of roughly 3 pounds, supplemented with olive oil, vinegared wine called pasca, and salt, from which we derive the word salary, since Roman soldiers were sometimes paid partly in salt. But the diet was far from being purely vegetarian or exclusively grain-based. Archaeological evidence from sites like Vindolanda on Hadrian's Wall in Britain shows that soldiers also consumed significant quantities of meat, fish, eggs, oysters, lentils, figs, and various vegetables. Hunting and foraging supplemented official rations, and soldiers stationed near rivers or coasts took advantage of local food sources. The Roman military supply system, the Annona Militaris, was one of the most complex logistical operations of the ancient world, capable of feeding tens of thousands of men across thousands of miles of empire. It was not always enough, but it was, by ancient standards, remarkable. The water discipline of the Roman legion was another area where Rome's organizational genius expressed itself in ways that have only recently been fully appreciated by historians and archaeologists. A marching Roman army needed enormous quantities of fresh water, not just for drinking, but for cooking, cleaning wounds, watering animals, and the basic hydraulic engineering required to maintain sanitation in a camp. Roman military engineers were trained to locate and evaluate water sources, dig wells, construct aqueducts and channels even in temporary camps, and distribute water through a system that prevented contamination. The use of pasca, wine vinegar diluted in water, as the standard military drink served a dual purpose. It tasted better than untreated water, and its acidity helped kill many of the waterborne pathogens that killed more ancient armies than combat ever did. Legionaries also had access to heated bath facilities even in permanent frontier forts, as evidenced by the remarkable preservation of Roman bathhouses at sites across Britain, Germany, and the Middle East. The Romans understood, in an entirely pre-scientific way, that cleanliness was connected to health. Their soldiers survived at rates that would have been impossible without these hygiene practices. Roman legionaries serving on the frontier faced something that no amount of combat training could fully prepare them for: the profound psychological experience of living for years in a place utterly unlike home. Men recruited in Italy, North Africa, or Syria might find themselves stationed in the gray, wet, fog-shrouded forests of Britain or along the frozen Danube frontier in what is now Romania. The culture shock was enormous. Many soldiers stationed in Britain, for example, left written records, tablets, letters scratched on thin pieces of wood that speak with remarkable poignancy about their longing for home, their complaints about the weather, and their requests for warm socks and underwear from their families. One letter found at Vindolanda, written around 100 CE, contains what is believed to be the oldest surviving personal letter written in Latin in Britain, an invitation to a birthday party. These men were not automatons. They were human beings, separated from everything familiar, doing a job that could kill them at any moment, trying to maintain some thread of normal human life across hundreds of miles of empire. The fact that they did it with such discipline and effectiveness, year after year, generation after generation, is one of the most remarkable achievements in military history. The Roman contubernium, the 8-man tent group that formed the basic social unit of the legion, was far more than a housing arrangement. It was a carefully engineered social structure designed to create bonds of loyalty, mutual accountability, and psychological resilience that would sustain men through the worst extremes of military life. These 8 men shared everything: a tent, a mule to carry their shared equipment, cooking duties, watch rotations, and the accumulated experience of years of campaigning together. They ate together, slept together, trained together, and fought together in the same formation. The psychological research behind modern military unit cohesion confirms what Rome discovered 2,000 years ago. Soldiers don't fight primarily for abstract concepts like country or glory. They fight for the men standing next to them. The contubernium made those men as close as brothers, closer in many cases, since brothers chose neither each other nor their circumstances. These 8 men were bound by shared suffering and shared survival in a way that created loyalty almost impossible to break. When one man fell in battle, his contubernals, his tentmates, fought with a fury that was partly grief, partly rage, and entirely devastating to whoever had caused the loss. Few aspects of Roman military life are as misunderstood as the role of the aquilifer, the eagle-bearer, and the extraordinary reverence that surrounded the legion's standard. The aquila, or eagle, was made of silver or gold and mounted on a pole. It was not merely a symbol or a rallying point, though it served both functions magnificently. It was, in the deepest sense, the living soul of the legion. To lose the eagle in battle was not simply a military defeat. It was a catastrophe of almost spiritual dimensions. The legion that lost its eagle was considered dishonored beyond the point of recovery. The 3rd Legion, for example, was disbanded after losing its eagle. When the Roman general Publius Quinctilius Varus lost 3 entire legions, and all 3 of their eagles, in the catastrophic ambush in the Teutoburg forest in 9C, the Emperor Augustus reportedly wandered his palace at night crying out, "Varus, give me back my legions." The subsequent Roman campaigns to recover those 3 eagles lasted decades and consumed enormous resources. When at least 2 were finally recovered, they were treated like holy relics returned to their rightful place. The aquilifer who carried the eagle in battle was one of the most important and vulnerable men in the formation, protected at all costs, because his fall meant something far worse than his death. The Roman military's relationship with religion was not incidental or merely ceremonial. It was woven into every aspect of legionary life in ways that fundamentally shaped the psychology and cohesion of the army. Each legion had its own patron deity and conducted regular religious observances, sacrifices, and festivals. The camp itself was a sacred space. Before a new camp was constructed, religious rituals were performed to consecrate the ground. Before battle, the haruspeks, a religious specialist, would examine the entrails of a sacrificed animal and pronounce whether the omens were favorable. A negative omen did not necessarily prevent a battle, but it created a psychological context that commanders ignored at their peril. The standards of the legion, not just the eagle, but the various signa of individual cohorts and centuries, were considered divine objects and were housed in a shrine within the camp. Soldiers prayed to them, offered sacrifices before them, and swore oaths in their presence. The genius of the Roman military religious system was that it reinforced unit identity, provided psychological comfort in terrifying situations, and created a framework of meaning around suffering and sacrifice that made it bearable. A soldier who believed his death served not just Rome but the divine order of the universe was, all else being equal, a better soldier. The Roman legion's capacity for siege warfare represented a level of engineering and organizational sophistication that would not be surpassed in Europe until the development of modern artillery in the 16th century. When a Roman army arrived before a fortified city or town, the outcome was, in most cases, simply a matter of time. The legion brought with it artillery in the form of the ballista, a torsion-powered crossbow-like device capable of hurling large bolts or stones with devastating accuracy, and the onager, a single-armed catapult that could throw heavy stones over considerable distances. But raw firepower was only one element of Roman siegecraft. Engineers would construct circumvallation lines, walls around the besieged city to prevent escape or resupply, and sometimes contravallation lines around those to prevent outside forces from relieving the siege. They built towers on wheels that could be rolled up to walls, ramps of packed earth sloping up to battlements, and the famous Testudo formation, soldiers locking their shields overhead and on the sides to create an armored shell that could advance under a rain of missiles. The siege of Masada in 73 to 74 CE, where Roman soldiers built a ramp over 1,400 feet long and nearly 300 feet high to reach a fortress on an isolated plateau, stands as perhaps the most extreme example of Roman determination and engineering combined. One of the most persistent myths about Roman legionaries is that they were all Italian or from the city of Rome itself. The reality is far more complex, more interesting, and ultimately more revealing about the nature of the Roman Empire. By the 1st century CE, the majority of legionaries were recruited not from Italy but from the provinces, from Spain, Gaul, the Danube region, North Africa, and eventually from the very frontier peoples Rome had conquered. Provincial men were offered citizenship upon enlistment, a powerful incentive that drove recruitment into areas where the Roman citizen population was thin. By the 2nd century, some legions stationed in particular provinces became so deeply rooted in their region that they began to recruit primarily from the local population, creating a fascinating hybrid identity: men who were culturally Roman in military terms but who spoke different languages at home, worshipped local deities alongside Roman ones, and whose physical features would have varied enormously from the Italian ideal. The Roman army was, in effect, one of history's first truly multicultural military institutions, not out of any idealistic commitment to diversity, but because the pragmatic demands of manning a frontier thousands of miles long made it an absolute necessity. The Roman legionary's relationship with money was complicated, carefully managed, and central to his motivations in ways that go far beyond simple mercenary calculation. A common legionary in the 1st century CE earned around 225 denarii per year under Augustus, a figure that sounds meaningless until you understand that it was significantly more than a Roman agricultural laborer could earn, and it came with guaranteed food, housing, equipment, and medical care. However, Rome did not simply hand over a soldier's full pay. Deductions were made for food, equipment replacement, burial club fees, and a compulsory savings account managed by the unit, an account the soldier could only access upon discharge. This savings mechanism served a dual purpose. It gave the soldier something to look forward to at the end of his 25-year service, and it reduced the likelihood of desertion since deserters forfeited their accumulated savings. On top of regular pay, soldiers could earn dona militaria with cash values, receive shares of war booty, and look forward to the premia militiae, a substantial discharge bonus that under Augustus amounted to around 3,000 denarii, equivalent to more than 13 years of full pay. For a man with no property and no prospects, the legion was not just a military institution. It was a social mobility system. The Romans developed what might be described as the ancient world's first professional medical corps, and its integration into the military system was so sophisticated that it stands as one of Rome's most underappreciated achievements. Legionary surgeons, known as medici, were trained specialists who received additional pay reflecting their status. The medical knowledge they applied was, by ancient standards, remarkably advanced. They understood the importance of cleaning wounds, used bronze surgical instruments of astonishing sophistication, performed amputations, extracted arrows and projectiles, and administered herbal medicines that modern pharmacological research has confirmed were genuinely effective. Hospitals, valetudinaria, were built into permanent forts with a floor plan specifically designed for medical care. Rows of individual rooms opening onto a central corridor, allowing air circulation and preventing the spread of infection through spatial separation of patients. At Novisium in modern Germany, archaeologists uncovered such a hospital with clear evidence of sophisticated medical practice. The Roman military understood that a soldier who survived a wound and returned to service was more valuable than a replacement recruit who needed years of training. That pragmatic calculation drove a medical system centuries ahead of its time. The famous Roman formation known as the Testudo, the tortoise, has been depicted in countless films and television shows, but the reality of executing this maneuver was far more demanding and tactically nuanced than any dramatization has captured. When a Roman unit needed to advance under missile fire, whether from arrows, javelins, sling stones, or rocks thrown from walls, it could form the testudo by having the outermost ranks hold their shields vertically on the exposed sides, while the interior ranks raised their shields horizontally overhead, creating an overlapping shell of wood and leather covering every exposed surface. Descriptions from ancient sources and modern experimental reconstructions suggest that the formation could withstand extraordinary punishment. Roman writer Cassius Dio described men driving carts over a testudo formed by a demonstration unit without breaking it. But maintaining the testudo while also moving forward required extraordinary discipline, upper body strength, and coordination. Men in the interior, with shields raised overhead and unable to see anything but the underside of the shields above them, had to trust completely in the unit's collective movement. Any gap, any moment of individual panic, and the formation became a death trap. The testudo is, in many ways, the perfect metaphor for the entire Roman military system. Individual strength, collective discipline, and absolute trust in the man beside you. What the Romans understood about the psychology of the enemy was as important as their understanding of their own psychology, and they systematically exploited enemy weaknesses with a sophistication that deserves to be called psychological warfare. Before many major battles, Roman commanders would use diplomatic emissaries, defectors from the enemy camp, and spies to gather intelligence about the opposing army's morale, supply situation, internal divisions, and leadership tensions. They would then time their attacks to maximize psychological impact, striking at dawn when the mind is at its lowest ebb, using the sun behind their backs to blind enemy archers and disrupt morale, or timing attacks to coincide with adverse omens that enemy troops might have observed. Roman engineering also served psychological functions. The sight of a fully fortified Roman camp appearing overnight where there had been empty fields was specifically designed to communicate to enemy observers the terrifying efficiency and invincibility of the Roman war machine. Julius Caesar was a master of this kind of psychological theater, deliberately constructing massive earthworks at Alesia not just for their military function but to impress upon the besieged Gauls the futility of resistance. The message Rome sent before every battle was the same: we are not just stronger than you. We are of a different category of being entirely. The relationship between the Roman legionary and his body, Specifically, his understanding of physical conditioning, injury prevention, and recovery was far more sophisticated than the popular image of ancient soldiers as simply tough men who ignored pain and pushed through. Roman military training included activities that modern sports science would recognize as progressive overload, gradually increasing the difficulty and intensity of physical tasks over time to build strength and endurance without causing debilitating injury. Recruits began marching with lighter loads and shorter distances, swimming in rivers and lakes to build cardiovascular fitness, and practicing weapons drills for short periods before extending them. The campus, the training ground, was a specific space within the fort or camp set aside for physical training, often large enough for cavalry maneuvers and organized athletic competitions. Legionaries were also required to be able to swim, an unusual skill requirement for ancient soldiers but one that reflected Roman pragmatism about river crossings and amphibious operations. Those who could not swim were taught. The Romans recognized that a physically broken soldier was as useless as a cowardly one, and the system was designed to produce maximum physical capability with minimum training casualties. It worked. Roman legionaries remained combat effective at ages that would have been considered elderly by the standards of most ancient armies. The story of the Roman legion at Alesia in 52 BCE is one of the most astonishing military engineering achievements ever recorded, and it reveals with perfect clarity the almost superhuman capability of the Roman legionary to solve impossible problems through sheer disciplined effort. Julius Caesar, with approximately 60,000 men, found himself attempting to besiege the Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix and his 80,000 warriors inside the fortified hilltop town of Alesia, while simultaneously facing the approach of a Gallic relief army that contemporary sources claim numbered between 250,000. Though modern historians suggest even 250,000 was likely exaggerated, a huge force was nonetheless coming. Caesar's solution was breathtaking in its audacity. He ordered his legions to construct two separate ring fortifications around Alesia, an inner ring facing the town, the circumvallation, roughly 11 miles in circumference, and an outer ring facing outward toward the relief army, the contravallation, roughly 14 miles in circumference. Both were equipped with towers every 80 feet, ditches, sharpened stakes, and concealed pits called lilia, lilies, filled with sharpened stakes and camouflaged with branches. The entire system was constructed in under 40 days. When the relief army arrived, Caesar's legionaries held both fronts simultaneously, fighting in two directions at once. Vercingetorix surrendered. The relief army dispersed. Caesar had defeated two armies with one. The Roman military's approach to the treatment of prisoners and conquered peoples was neither uniformly brutal nor consistently merciful. It was, in a characteristically Roman way, entirely pragmatic. In the aftermath of a successful siege or battle, Roman commanders made calculated decisions about what to do with the defeated based primarily on military and economic logic rather than morality. Populations that had surrendered without significant resistance or who had strategic value as future allies were often treated with relative leniency. Populations that had resisted fiercely, massacred Roman soldiers, or broken previous treaties might be sold into slavery en masse, which was enormously profitable and had the secondary effect of replacing the local population with a more docile one. The specific practice of the triumph, the victory procession through Rome, included the display of conquered leaders in chains before the Roman populace, after which the enemy king or general would typically be strangled in the Tullianum prison. This was not mere cruelty. It was theater, designed to communicate the absolute consequences of opposing Rome. The Gaul Vercingetorix waited in chains in Rome for 6 years following Alesia before being displayed in Caesar's triumph and then executed. That 6-year wait was itself a statement. Rome's memory was long, its reach was absolute, and its judgment was inevitable. The role of cavalry in the Roman legion is often misunderstood, partly because the image of the Roman army is so dominated by the heavily armored infantrymen. In truth, Roman legions did include a cavalry component, the Equites legionis, of approximately 120 horsemen per legion, used primarily for scouting, pursuit, and communication rather than the thunderous shock charges associated with later medieval knights or Macedonian heavy cavalry. The Romans were pragmatic enough to recognize that their own cavalry, while useful, was not their strongest arm, and they increasingly relied on auxiliary cavalry units drawn from peoples with deep equestrian traditions: Numidians from North Africa, Sarmatians from the steppes, Syrian mounted archers, and eventually Germanic federates. These allied cavalry units brought their own weapons, tactics, and traditions into the Roman military system, supplementing the legion's infantry corps with capabilities it could not develop internally in a short time frame. The relationship between Roman infantry and auxiliary cavalry became one of the defining features of Roman combined arms warfare. The infantry provided the anvil, unbreakable and methodical, while the cavalry provided the hammer, exploiting gaps, turning flanks, and running down enemies who tried to flee. Neither was sufficient alone. Together, they were devastating. The Roman army developed what might be the ancient world's most effective system of military intelligence, and while it lacked the institutional sophistication of a modern intelligence service, it was far more organized and effective than the forces it faced. Dedicated scouts, explorators, and speculators ranged far ahead of the main force, observing enemy movements, counting campfires to estimate numbers, and assessing terrain. Merchants, traders, and travelers were routinely debriefed by Roman officers when they passed through military territory. In frontier zones, the Romans developed networks of watchtowers, burgi, connected by signal fires that could communicate warnings across hundreds of miles within hours. The limes, the frontier system of walls, ditches, roads, and forts, was as much a surveillance network as a defensive barrier. It was designed not to stop an invasion through sheer obstruction but to detect, slow, and channel enemy movements in ways that allowed the mobile Roman army to respond effectively. The intelligence gathered from these systems allowed Roman commanders to anticipate enemy movements, choose favorable battle sites, and occasionally achieve the kind of strategic surprise that turned potential disasters into decisive victories. Caesar's campaigns in Gaul are filled with examples of his using superior intelligence to outmaneuver numerically larger forces. The manner in which Roman legionaries dealt with the physical reality of battlefield wounds is one of the most sobering aspects of their existence, and it forces us to confront the true cost of Roman military power in human terms. In battle, the primary wounds a legionary faced were from bladed weapons, sword and spear thrusts and cuts, projectiles including arrows, sling stones, and pilum impacts, and crushing blows from clubs, war hammers, and the press of the battle itself. Without antiseptic knowledge, without anesthesia beyond pain-dulling herbs and wine, surgical procedures were conducted on conscious patients held down by strong men, or given enough wine to partially dull sensation. Arrow extraction was particularly agonizing, often requiring the shaft to be pushed further through the wound to expose the barbed head from the other side rather than pulling it back against the barbs. Despite these limitations, Roman military medicine achieved survival rates that would not be matched in military medicine until the 20th century, partly through the quality of their surgical techniques and partly through the extraordinary physical resilience of men who had spent years building their bodies to withstand punishment. Recovery occurred in the valetudinarium, where the combination of rest, clean food, and competent nursing gave men who had survived the immediate aftermath of wounding a genuine chance of returning to service. The Roman legion's experience of winter quarters, the hiberna, reveals a side of legionary life that stands in sharp contrast to the image of the perpetually marching, perpetually fighting soldier. Ancient armies fought primarily in spring, summer, and early autumn. Winter campaigns were possible but extremely difficult and relatively rare. For most legionaries, winter meant a period of relative rest in permanent or semi-permanent quarters, and Rome used this time with characteristic efficiency. The men maintained their equipment, repaired fortifications, underwent additional training, and fulfilled administrative duties. But winter quarters also meant something more socially significant: proximity to civilian settlements. Around virtually every Roman military installation, civilian communities, canabi and vici, grew up to serve the economic needs of the garrison. Merchants, craftsmen, entertainers, and the families of soldiers all gathered in these communities, which over time could grow into substantial towns. Many modern European cities, Vienna, Cologne, York, Strasbourg, began as civilian settlements adjacent to Roman military bases. The legionary stationed for years or decades in one location often developed deep roots in the local community, taking unofficial families. Formalized marriage was prohibited for common soldiers until the 3rd century CE, and becoming embedded in the social fabric of the region in ways that profoundly shaped the culture of the provinces. One of the most remarkable and darkest aspects of Roman military history is the experience of legionaries captured by the enemy, a situation that Rome officially considered deeply shameful but which was far more common than Roman propaganda preferred to acknowledge. When Roman soldiers were taken prisoner, their fate depended entirely on who had captured them. Germanic and Celtic peoples might enslave them, hold them for ransom, sacrifice them to tribal deities, or, in some accounts, use them as gladiatorial opponents in ritual combat. The Parthians, Rome's most formidable eastern adversary, were known to put captured legionaries to work on construction projects deep in the interior of their empire, effectively disappearing them from Roman consciousness entirely. The soldiers captured after Crassus's catastrophic defeat at Carrhae in 53 BC, where around 20,000 Romans were killed or captured, were reportedly settled by the Parthians as a garrison force in the eastern frontier province of Margiana, modern Turkmenistan. One tantalizing but disputed historical theory suggests that some of these men may eventually have made their way even further east, potentially appearing in Chinese historical records as mysterious foreign warriors with unusual military techniques. Whether true or legend, the possibility haunts the imagination with the image of legionaries, impossibly far from home, carrying Rome with them to the edge of the known world. The Roman military's relationship with religion was complicated further by the extraordinary diversity of cults and deities that soldiers encountered as the empire expanded. A legionary who had grown up in rural Italy worshipping Jupiter, Juno, and Mars might find himself stationed in Syria encountering the cult of Mithras, or in Britain facing the local worship of Sulis at the thermal springs of what is now Bath. The Roman military response to this religious diversity was characteristically pragmatic. Rather than suppressing local religions, Rome generally absorbed them, often identifying local deities with Roman equivalents in a process called interpretatio Romana. Soldiers were also remarkably free, in general, to worship whatever additional deities appealed to them alongside the official Roman pantheon. The cult of Mithras, a mystery religion of Persian origin involving initiation rituals, communal meals, and imagery of bull slaying, became extraordinarily popular among Roman soldiers, particularly officers. Mithraic temples, or Mithraea, have been found at military sites across the empire from Britain to Syria. The religion offered something the official state religion did not: a tight-knit community of initiates bound by shared secret knowledge, a personal relationship with a divine protector, and a narrative of cosmic struggle and ultimate triumph that resonated powerfully with men whose lives were defined by struggle and the constant proximity of death. The logistics system that sustained Roman military campaigns was arguably Rome's greatest military achievement, more important, in the long view of history, than any individual battle or tactical innovation. Moving an army of 60,000 men required feeding them roughly 180,000 pounds of grain per week, plus the fodder for thousands of horses and pack animals, plus timber for construction, metal for weapons and tools, leather for armor and tents, and medical supplies. This staggering logistical load was managed through a combination of advanced supply dumps established in friendly territory, requisitioning from local populations along the line of march, a practice governed by law and not simply plunder, though the distinction blurred in hostile territory, river transport wherever possible, and the extraordinary cargo-carrying capacity of the legion itself. Each soldier carried his own grain ration, cooking equipment, personal tools, 3 or 4 days' supply of water, and his sharpened stakes for camp construction, in addition to his weapons and armor. The pack mule allocated to each contubernium carried the tent and heavier equipment. A Roman army on the march presented an almost unimaginable supply chain of humanity and animals stretching sometimes miles back along the road. That this system functioned reliably enough to project Roman power to Scotland, Mesopotamia, and the Sahara Desert is a logistical achievement without parallel in the ancient world. The Roman military system created something that was, for its time, almost entirely unprecedented. A professional standing army whose institutional identity persisted across generations regardless of the individual men who composed it. A legion like the 3rd Augustan in North Africa or the 8th Augusta on the Rhine maintained its identity, its standards, its records, and its traditions across centuries, even as the men within it were born, served, and died in successive waves. This institutional continuity meant that a new recruit joining the 3rd Augustan in 200 CE was inheriting a tradition and an identity that stretched back over 200 years. The unit's battle honors, its personal mythologies, its vendettas against particular enemy peoples, and its pride in particular achievements were transmitted through military culture in exactly the same way that institutional memory is transmitted in modern military units or even in schools and universities. The Legion trained its recruits not just in weapons and tactics but in its own history, or at least its own mythology, which served the same psychological function. A man who understood himself as part of something ancient and glorious, something that had survived and triumphed across generations, was a more resilient and more motivated soldier than one who thought of himself merely as a temporary employee of the state. The experience of a Roman legionary crossing a major river, the Rhine, the Danube, the Euphrates, was a logistical and engineering challenge that reveals once again the extraordinary range of capabilities Rome demanded from its soldiers. The Roman military maintained a specialized corps of engineers, Fabri, but crossing a major river was often a task that fell to the entire legion. Roman engineers could construct a pontoon bridge, a series of flat-bottomed boats anchored in the river and connected by a wooden deck strong enough to support marching men, horses, and heavy artillery, with astonishing speed. Caesar's famous construction of a bridge across the Rhine in 10 days, using driven piles and a complex framework of timber, remains one of the most celebrated engineering feats of the ancient world. He then crossed into Germanic territory, demonstrated Rome's ability to project power beyond the natural barrier of the Great River, and returned, pulling the bridge down behind him. The message was deliberate and precisely calculated. The Rhine was no protection against Rome. When bridges were not feasible, legionaries crossed rivers using inflated animal skins as flotation devices, or in boats improvised from hollowed logs or bundled reeds, or simply by swimming, which, as noted, all Roman soldiers were trained to do. Water did not stop Rome. It merely required a different set of tools. The Roman military's use of what we might call information technology, the systematic recording, copying, and transmission of military orders, reports, and intelligence, was far more sophisticated than is generally appreciated. The Roman army generated enormous quantities of written documentation, muster rolls recording every soldier's name, pay grade, posting, and health status, supply requisitions, orders of the day, intelligence reports, letters to and from commanders. At Vindolanda in northern England, archaeologists have recovered nearly 500 writing tablets, thin slivers of wood covered in ink script, that together constitute the largest archive of handwritten documents from Roman Britain. They include troop strength reports noting that a particular unit is sickly, requisitions for beer and wagon axles, a scathing assessment of local British warriors noting that they are unarmored and do not even have the sense to draw back a sword before thrusting, and the birthday party invitation mentioned earlier. This documentary culture meant that the Roman military could function as a true institution. Decisions made at the top could be transmitted accurately to subordinates, accountability could be enforced across vast distances, and the accumulated experience of campaigns could be preserved and consulted. The writing tablet was, in its way, as important a military technology as the Pilum or the gladius. The question of what Roman legionaries looked like, their physical appearance, their fitness level, the wear that years of service left on their bodies, has been addressed with surprising specificity by recent advances in bioarchaeology. When Roman military cemeteries have been excavated and their skeletal remains analyzed, the data tells a consistent and vivid story. The bones of Roman soldiers show evidence of extreme muscular development, particularly in the right arm and shoulder, consistent with the overarm throwing motion of the pilum and the rotational stress of gladius training. Spinal deformations consistent with carrying heavy loads for extended periods appear in many specimens. Healed fractures are common, particularly in the forearms, defensive injuries from blocking weapons. And dental health, while often poor by modern standards, was generally better in Roman soldiers than in the civilian population, likely reflecting the regularity and adequacy of military rations compared to the often deficient diet of the poor. The average height of Roman soldiers, as calculated from these skeletal studies, was approximately 5 feet 6 inches, somewhat taller than the average civilian of the same period and region, consistent with the physical selection criteria of recruitment. These are not abstract historical figures. They were real men, and their bones still carry the story of what Rome demanded of them. The Roman military's approach to camp sanitation was, by ancient standards, almost obsessively systematic, and it provides one of the clearest examples of how Roman pragmatism translated directly into military effectiveness. Latrines, forica, in Roman military installations were sophisticated multi-seat structures that channeled waste away through underground drains into separate disposal areas well away from the water supply and food storage. At permanent forts, latrine blocks were regularly maintained, supplied with running water where the engineering permitted, and located downwind from the main inhabited areas. Even in temporary marching camps, designated latrine trenches were constructed outside the rampart walls. Soldiers were strictly prohibited from defecating anywhere else within the camp, and the centurions enforced this rule with the same vigor they applied to military duties. The reason was straightforwardly practical. Armies that camped in their own filth succumbed to dysentery, typhoid, and other enteric diseases at catastrophic rates. The history of pre-modern warfare is largely a history of armies destroyed by their own excrement rather than by the enemy. Rome's almost paranoid insistence on sanitation discipline was one of the key reasons its armies remained functional in the field for months and years, while their enemies, often living in traditional encampments without the same infrastructure, were being steadily weakened by preventable disease. The Roman military system of promotion and advancement was, for the ancient world, remarkably meritocratic, though not without its aristocratic biases, and understanding it helps explain the astonishing longevity of Roman military effectiveness. At the lowest level, a common miles could earn promotion to the role of immunes, a soldier excused from the most tedious fatigues because of a specialist skill such as blacksmithing, carpentry, or medical work, without any formal increase in rank. From there, a man might become a tesserarius, responsible for distributing the watchword to his unit, or an optio, the centurion's deputy and second in command of the century. The pinnacle of the non-commissioned structure was the centurionate, and within the centurionate there existed a complex hierarchy of seniority, with the most senior centurion of the most senior cohort, the primus pilus, or first spear, being one of the most prestigious positions in the Roman military. A man who achieved the primus pilate was genuinely elevated in Roman society, eligible for posts of great administrative responsibility and social distinction after his military service. The Roman system created a career ladder that extended across decades, giving men a sustained motivation for excellence that pure pay or fear of punishment could never have provided alone. The ambition it cultivated was not the dangerous, destabilizing ambition of aristocratic competition. It was the steady, disciplined ambition of professional excellence. The Roman military's relationship with time itself was distinctive and carefully managed in ways that reveal much about Roman organizational philosophy. The military day was divided into watches, vigiliae, of approximately 3 hours each, organized so that every man took his turn at guard duty at regular intervals through the night. The distribution of the watchword, the tessera, a small wooden tablet passed from the duty officer to each unit in turn, was a specific ceremony performed every evening, ensuring that sentries could identify friend from foe in the darkness. The calendar of the military year was marked by specific religious festivals and ceremonies, many tied to the official Roman calendar but others specific to the military world. The anniversary of the legion's founding, ceremonies honoring the divine emperors, the annual renewal of the oath. These temporal structures served a psychological function beyond mere organization. They created predictability in an environment that was otherwise defined by uncertainty and danger. When everything around you might change from day to day, the enemy's movements, the weather, the supply situation, the orders from above, The reliable structure of the daily and annual military cycle provided an anchor of stability that helped prevent the psychological deterioration that affected men living under sustained stress without predictable routine. The Roman concept of virtus, which is usually translated as virtue, but which originally and most fundamentally meant something closer to manliness or martial excellence, was the central cultural value around which the entire military ethos of the legion was organized. Virtus was not a soft or abstract concept. It was demonstrated through specific, visible, measurable behaviors: standing your ground in battle, obeying orders without hesitation, enduring pain and hardship without complaint, and showing physical courage in the face of death. A man of virtus did not need to be reminded to do his duty. He did it because the alternative, the failure that would mark him as lacking virtus, was more terrible to him than death itself. The Roman military exploited this cultural value with enormous sophistication. Public recognition of virtus, through decorations, through praise from commanders, through the cheers of one's fellow soldiers, was deeply motivating. Public shaming of its absence, through demotion, through assignment to degrading tasks, through the contempt of one's peers, was correspondingly devastating. The entire honor culture of the Roman military was built around the idea that what your fellow soldiers thought of you mattered more than anything, more than pay, more than comfort, more than your own safety. That culture, reinforced through every ritual and ceremony of military life, produced soldiers who fought at a level of sustained effectiveness that armies motivated by cruder means could rarely match. The physical reality of Roman armor is far more interesting and varied than the popular image of the larica segmentata, the banded iron plate armor familiar from every Hollywood Roman film, would suggest. The larica segmentata is real, but it represents only one phase of Roman military history and only one type of armor among several. Earlier legionaries wore the larica hamata, chainmail, which was heavier but more flexible and cheaper to produce, offering excellent protection against slashing blows though less resistance to thrusting weapons. Later periods saw the widespread use of larica squamata, scale armor made of overlapping metal or leather scales attached to a backing fabric. The famous larica segmentata itself, the articulated plate armor of the 1st and 2nd century CE, was a Roman innovation that provided superior protection against the downward chopping blows of Germanic and British warriors, at the expense of weight and complexity. Each type of armor required different maintenance, different manufacturing skills, and different fighting techniques. Roman armorers were highly skilled and highly valued craftsmen, and the legion's workshops maintained the equipment of thousands of men with systematic efficiency. Beneath whatever outer armor he wore, the legionary wore a thick woolen or linen undergarment, the subarmalis, that provided padding against the bruising impact of blows that the armor deflected but didn't completely absorb. The Roman military's engagement with what we might call counterinsurgency, dealing with populations that refused to accept Roman rule after military conquest, was a persistent challenge that revealed both the strengths and the limits of the legionary system. Germanic tribes across the Rhine, Berber warriors in North Africa, Jewish revolutionaries in Judea, and Scottish Highland clans beyond Hadrian's Wall all demonstrated that determined, irregular resistance could blunt even the legionaries' formidable capabilities. Rome's response to insurgency combined methods that would be recognizable to modern strategists: punitive expeditions designed to destroy the economic base of resistance by burning crops and villages, fortified road networks that divided resistant territory into manageable sectors, the strategic relocation of troublesome populations, and the cultivation of local elites who could be integrated into the Roman administrative system as collaborators. But Rome also recognized that permanent military occupation of every square mile was impossible, and there were populations and landscapes: the Scottish Highlands, the German forests beyond the Rhine, the Saharan desert, where the cost-benefit calculation of complete conquest never worked out in Rome's favor. The decision of emperors from Hadrian onward to consolidate rather than expand reflected a sophisticated strategic awareness of the limits of legionary power in terrain and against enemies that neutralized its key advantages. The cornisan and tubisan, the hornblower and trumpeter of the Roman legion, served functions so critical that they deserve special attention as an underappreciated element of Roman military effectiveness. In the chaos of ancient battle, where thousands of men were engaged across hundreds of meters, verbal commands were simply impossible to transmit. Even shouting could rarely be heard above the roar of clashing metal, screaming men, and the general cacophony of mass combat. The solution Rome developed was a standardized system of military signals transmitted through 3 distinct instruments. The tuba, a straight bronze trumpet producing a high, carrying sound. The cornu, a large circular horn used for slower, more ceremonial signals. And the bucina, a curved instrument used within the camp. Every legionary was trained to recognize specific calls and respond to them instantly and automatically. The call to advance. The call to halt. The call to wheel left or right. The call to retreat, which, crucially, was designed to prevent the kind of panicked rout that destroyed armies, and instead effect a controlled, fighting withdrawal in good order. The musicians who played these instruments were among the most highly trained specialists in the army, and their continued functioning in the middle of battle was so important that they were typically positioned near the standards and given additional protection. When the music stopped in an ancient battle, it often meant the formation was breaking down, and everyone on both sides knew it. The Roman military's use of the asta, the thrusting spear, as a primary weapon in the earlier Republican period, before the gladius became dominant, is a reminder that the legionary system was not static but constantly evolving in response to experience and changing threats. The manipular system of the mid-Republican army, organized around small tactical units called maniples rather than the later cohorts, had different weapons and different tactics, reflecting the different enemies Rome faced before it became a Mediterranean empire. The transition from the phalanx-influenced tactics of early Rome to the flexible manipular system, and then to the cohort-based legion, represents one of the most significant organizational evolutions in military history, and it happened not through theoretical planning but through the brutal trial and error of actual combat against formidable opponents. The Samnites, the Carthaginians under Hannibal, and the Macedonian phalanxes all forced Rome to rethink and reform its military methods. The willingness to adopt enemy innovations, including the gladius itself, which was adapted from Iberian Spanish designs encountered during the wars in Spain, rather than maintaining an ideologically rigid adherence to traditional methods, was one of Rome's most distinctive and most productive military traits. The experience of fighting against Rome, and specifically against the legion, was psychologically as well as physically overwhelming, and accounts from the enemies Rome faced give us a perspective that purely Roman sources naturally tend to suppress. Greek historian Polybius, who witnessed Roman military operations firsthand, described the effect on enemies of the legionary charge as something beyond ordinary combat experience. The combination of the Pilum volley at close range, immediately followed by the crash of thousands of armored men hitting the enemy line at a run while screaming their war cry, the shields punching forward, the gladii thrusting short and fast from behind the shield wall, all of this was designed to produce a specific psychological effect. The sensation that you were not fighting men but something mechanical and unstoppable. Germanic tribal warriors, who valued individual heroic combat, found the Roman style of fighting methodical, impersonal, collective, not just physically dangerous but psychologically alien and disorienting. Celtic warriors who charged Rome with terrifying energy and noise would slam into the shield wall and find that their energy was absorbed rather than matched, that the line bent but did not break, and that the slow, implacable Roman response was more terrifying than any countercharge. The lesson Rome's enemies learned, repeatedly and at devastating cost, was that fighting the legion on its own terms was a death sentence. One of the most fascinating and least discussed aspects of Roman military service was the experience of veterans, men who had completed their 25 years of service, collected their discharge bonus, and returned to civilian life. These men were, by any measure, transformed from whoever they had been when they enlisted. They spoke the military Latin dialect that had developed across the legions as a common language. They carried the scars and physical wear of decades of campaigning. They had seen things, battle, death, foreign lands, and the full breadth of the Roman world, that were utterly beyond the experience of most civilians. Many chose to settle in the region where they had served rather than returning to their place of origin, receiving an allotment of land in one of the coloniae, veteran settlements, that Rome established across the empire. Others settled in the civilian communities adjacent to their former bases, where they had unofficial families and established roots. Some re-enlisted as evocati, specially recalled veterans who received pay and status above the common soldiers. The veteran communities that developed in these ways were significant cultural forces in the provinces, men who embodied Roman military values, who maintained connections to the active army, and who served as living transmitters of Roman culture into the local population. The Roman Empire was built not just by the legions in the field but by the veterans they left behind wherever they went. The Roman military's approach to the construction of permanent frontier fortifications, the various lime systems that ran along the Rhine, Danube in North Africa, and most famously in Britain as Hadrian's Wall, represented not just a defensive strategy but a comprehensive theory of imperial management. Hadrian's Wall, begun around 122 CE on the orders of Emperor Hadrian during his personal inspection tour of the frontier, stretched 73 miles across the narrowest part of northern Britain from the Solway Firth to the River Tyne. It was not designed to be a purely passive barrier. A force trying to cross the wall in large numbers would quickly run into trouble, but its more significant function was to regulate, monitor, and tax movement across the frontier, channel legitimate cross-border traffic through controlled gateways, and give the Roman garrison advance warning of any hostile incursion. The wall was manned not primarily by legionaries, those were kept in reserve at major fortresses behind the wall, but by auxiliary units of non-citizen soldiers. The garrison's daily routine involved patrols, maintenance, customs duties, diplomatic meetings with local tribal leaders, and the endless administrative work of running a border crossing across hundreds of miles. Hadrian's Wall was, in its way, as much a bureaucratic institution as a military one, and it stood as a functioning frontier barrier for nearly 3 centuries. The story of the 9th Legion, the Legio IX Hispana, is one of the most enduring mysteries of Roman military history, and it has generated more romantic speculation than almost any other episode in the entire saga of the legions. The 9th was one of Julius Caesar's veteran legions, with a history stretching back to the social war of the early 1st century BC. By the early 2nd century CE, it was stationed at Eboracum, modern York, in northern Britain. And then it simply disappears from the historical record. The last definitive evidence of the 9th as an active unit dates to around 108 CE. A later Roman document listing all existing legions, compiled in the 3rd century, does not include the 9th. What happened to it? The most dramatic theory, popularized in Rosemary Sutcliffe's novel The Eagle of the 9th, is that the legion marched north into Caledonia, modern Scotland, and was annihilated by Pictish warriors in the unrecorded wilderness beyond the frontier. More recently, some historians have suggested that the legion was transferred from Britain to the eastern frontier and destroyed during one of the major conflicts in Judea or against the Parthians. The honest answer is that we simply do not know. The 9th Legion walked into history's darkness and never came back, and that mystery, the Lost Legion, continues to exercise a hold on the imagination that no amount of prosaic historical analysis can fully dissolve. The Roman military's capacity for adaptation when faced with radically different environments and enemies extended to desert warfare, which presented challenges that a military system developed in the Mediterranean basin had not originally anticipated. Legions stationed in Syria, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and along the North African frontier had to contend with extreme heat, limited water sources, different local diseases, and enemies who were often expert at mobile desert warfare on horseback or camel. The Roman response was typically systematic. Water points along desert routes were mapped and fortified. March timings were adjusted to avoid the worst midday heat. Desert-appropriate uniforms and equipment modifications emerged, lighter fabrics, different sandal designs, adjustments to the standard daily ration to account for heat-related salt loss. Local knowledge was aggressively recruited through the enlistment of auxiliary units from desert-dwelling peoples who understood the terrain instinctively. The Romans were never entirely comfortable in desert environments, and there were genuine failures. Crassus's catastrophe at Carrhae was partly a result of underestimating both the terrain and the Parthian army's adaptation to it. but the ability to function at all as an effective fighting force in environments ranging from Scottish fog to Mesopotamian desert heat is itself a testament to the extraordinary flexibility and resilience of the legionary system. The Roman military's use of artillery, the tormenta, meaning twisting machines, was sophisticated enough that Roman armies could field what amounted to field artillery support in open battle as well as in sieges. The ballista was essentially a giant crossbow powered by torsion springs made of twisted sinew or hair, capable of firing large bolts with enough force to punch through multiple men standing in line, or to hurl stones that could demolish light field fortifications. Roman accounts describe ballistae being mounted on carts for mobility and deployed in batteries to provide suppressing fire against enemy formations. The onager, a single-armed catapult named after the wild ass because of the vicious kick of its arm, threw large stones in a high arc and was primarily a siege weapon, though it could be used in field battles to disrupt enemy formations. The Scorpio, a smaller, lighter torsion crossbow mounted on a stand, was accurate enough at ranges up to several hundred meters to be used by skilled operators against individual targets. Each legion maintained a complement of artillery and the specialists trained to operate and maintain these machines, giving the Roman military a ranged firepower advantage that most of the peoples it fought could not match or counter effectively. The combination of massed artillery fire, organized infantry assault, and mobile cavalry was what modern military theorists call combined arms warfare, and the Romans practiced it with devastating effectiveness. The story of the Roman legionary in the context of civil wars, and Rome had many, from the conflicts of Marius and Sulla through Caesar and Pompey to the chaos of the year of the four emperors in 69 CE and beyond, reveals a deeply human dimension that gets lost in the larger political narrative. These were soldiers who had sworn their sacred oath to the emperor, to Rome, and to their standards, and who suddenly found themselves facing men from other legions. Men trained the same way they were, using the same weapons, fighting in the same formations, across a battlefield. The psychological cost of this was enormous. Roman writers describe the horror that soldiers felt at killing Roman citizens, at seeing the distinctive armor and standards of fellow legionaries among the enemy dead. At the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BCE, where Caesar's veterans faced the Republican army of Pompey, both sides were composed of trained Roman soldiers, and the battle was fought with a desperation and ferocity that observers noted was unlike the more controlled violence of wars against foreign enemies. Civil wars also created the problem of divided loyalties, soldiers whose commanders had declared for opposite sides, families split between opposing factions, veterans of shared campaigns suddenly standing in opposite lines. These conflicts were not just military events. They were profound social traumas that the Roman system, built on loyalty as its foundation, was never entirely equipped to manage. The Praetorian Guard, the elite household troops who guarded the emperor in Rome itself, represented both the pinnacle and the most dangerous distortion of the legionary system. Established by Augustus as a permanent imperial guard, the Praetorians received significantly higher pay than ordinary legionaries. Initially 1.5 times more, later 3 times more, served shorter terms of enlistment, were stationed in and around the capital rather than on distant frontiers, and occupied barracks in Rome from the reign of Tiberius onward. These advantages created an elite that increasingly saw itself as separate from and superior to the frontier legions, and whose proximity to the emperor gave it a political power entirely disproportionate to its military importance. Over time, the Praetorian Guard became a king-making institution, capable of murdering emperors they disliked and installing preferred successors, occasionally even auctioning the imperial position to the highest bidder. The infamous occasion in 193 CE when the Praetorians murdered Emperor Pertinax and then literally offered the empire to whoever would pay the most, a bidding war won briefly by a wealthy senator named Didius Julianus, represented the absolute nadir of this corruption. The subsequent history of the Praetorians is a cautionary tale about what happens when a military force becomes detached from the disciplinary and operational demands of actual service and becomes instead a political faction in armored clothing. The relationship between Roman legionaries and the local civilian populations they were stationed among was complex, frequently exploitative, occasionally tender, and always formative for both parties. Roman soldiers, young men, far from home, with money in their pockets and weapons on their belts, were not always ideal neighbors. Ancient sources and legal codes are full of regulations designed to prevent soldiers from exploiting civilians. Prohibitions against soldiers appropriating civilian property without payment, restrictions on requisitioning accommodation without compensation, rules against soldiers engaging in trade that competed with local merchants. The fact that such regulations needed to exist tells us that abuses occurred regularly. But the relationship was not purely predatory. Roman soldiers brought money into local economies. They created demand for local goods and services, food, wine, entertainment, sexual services, crafts. They built infrastructure, roads, bridges, aqueducts, that benefited civilian populations. They brought literacy, Latin, and Roman cultural practices that over generations transformed the cultural identity of frontier provinces. The process by which Britain, Gaul, Spain, and the Danube provinces became thoroughly Romanized was not primarily the result of political decree. It was the long, messy, complicated process of soldiers living among local populations across centuries of shared experience. The Aquila, the legion's sacred eagle standard, was not the only standard within the Roman legion, and the entire system of military standards reveals the sophisticated layering of identity and loyalty within the legionary structure. Below the legion-level eagle, each cohort carried its own standard, the signum, carried by a specialist soldier called the signifer, who was recognizable by his distinctive bearskin headdress. The signifer also served as the century's banker, maintaining the unit's savings accounts and distributing pay, which reflected the dual function of the standard as both a tactical rallying point and a symbol of collective identity and accountability. The imago, a standard carrying the portrait of the reigning emperor, reminded soldiers of their personal loyalty to the man who was simultaneously their employer, their supreme commander, and a quasi-divine figure. And the vexillum, a rectangular flag on a horizontal crossbar, was used to identify detachments of legionaries sent on independent operations away from the main body, which gave rise to the term vexillation for such detachments and from which we derive the word vexillology for the study of flags. This multilayered system of standards meant that every level of the military hierarchy had its own symbol, its own physical embodiment of collective identity, its own sacred object around which the unit's loyalty and self-image crystallized. The Roman military's experience at the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC, one of the most catastrophic defeats in Roman history, and Rome's response to that defeat, tells us perhaps more about the Roman character than any other single episode. At Cannae, the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca destroyed a Roman army of perhaps 70,000 men, the largest army Rome had ever fielded, through a masterpiece of tactical encirclement. The Romans, who had been expecting to use their numerical superiority to simply overwhelm the smaller Carthaginian force, found themselves compressed into an increasingly tight mass by Hannibal's deliberately withdrawing center, while his flanks and cavalry completed the encirclement. Unable to move or properly deploy their weapons, packed so tightly that some men reportedly suffocated, the Romans were slaughtered at a rate that modern estimates suggest approached 600 men per minute at the battle's climax, making Cannae one of the bloodiest single days in all of military history. Rome lost approximately 50,000 men killed in a single afternoon. And Rome's response? It did not surrender. It did not negotiate. It raised new legions. It recalled veterans. It adjusted its tactics and strategy. And 16 years later, at Zama, it destroyed Hannibal's army and won the war. The response to Cannae reveals the Roman military system's most essential characteristic, not its tactical sophistication or its engineering genius, but its absolute, seemingly pathological refusal to accept defeat as final. The Roman military's engagement with naval warfare is often underemphasized in popular accounts that focus on the land battles, yet Rome built and fought with some of the largest naval forces in the ancient world, and legionaries were integral to naval operations in ways that reflect the land-centric nature of Roman military thinking. Roman warships carried marines, essentially legionaries who had been assigned to ship duty, whose function in naval battle was not primarily to sink enemy ships but to board them and fight the enemy crew hand-to-hand. The corvus, a grappling device with an iron spike that could be dropped onto an enemy ship's deck to lock the two vessels together, was a Roman naval innovation specifically designed to turn sea battles into the kind of close-quarters infantry combat that Roman soldiers excelled at. When the Corvus was deployed, the rolling sea became, in effect, a battlefield that Roman marines could master in ways that negated the superior seamanship of Carthaginian and Greek naval opponents. Roman legionaries also served as rowers in the lower decks of warships during major operations, a physically brutal assignment that would have horrified the free Roman citizens' sense of dignity, but which military necessity overrode in moments of crisis. The Roman Navy's ability to project legionary power across the Mediterranean was as fundamental to the creation of the empire as any land campaign. The Roman military's treatment of military time off, the concept of leave and recreation, reflects a surprisingly nuanced understanding of the human need for rest and the psychological management of soldiers serving in difficult conditions. Legionaries could petition their centurions for leave, comitus, and such petitions, if granted, required the payment of a bribe to the centurion in many documented cases. This corrupt practice was so widespread that it was eventually addressed by military reformers, though never entirely eliminated. Leave allowed soldiers to return to their families, visit cities, engage in commerce, and generally recover from the psychological pressure of military life. Within the camp itself, recreation took the form of gambling, prohibited but universally practiced, with dice and board games being found archaeologically at virtually every Roman military site, athletic competition, hunting where the local environment permitted, and the various entertainments provided by the civilian communities that grew up around permanent bases. Amphitheaters were constructed adjacent to some major legionary fortresses specifically to provide gladiatorial games and other spectacles for the garrison. The Romans understood that men kept under sustained pressure without relief were men heading toward breakdown, and while the military's primary concern was military effectiveness rather than soldier welfare, these happened to coincide often enough that a rough system of stress management evolved organically within the legionary culture. The Roman legionaries' relationship with the night, specifically with the psychological terror that ancient soldiers felt in darkness, is an aspect of ancient warfare that deserves more attention than it typically receives. Modern humans with electric light have largely lost our visceral fear of the dark, but for ancient soldiers living in a world without artificial illumination, night was genuinely threatening in ways that went beyond the practical danger of ambush. The Roman military addressed the night with characteristic organizational efficiency. The forewatch system ensured that alert soldiers were always on duty, campfires were maintained at regular intervals along the perimeter, password challenges were strictly enforced, and punishments for sleeping on guard duty were extreme. A soldier caught sleeping while on night watch could be beaten to death by his fellow soldiers. Night attacks, while rare, were used by Roman commanders precisely because of the psychological terror they induced in the enemy, and the training of legionaries to respond to trumpet signals automatically and correctly even when awakened suddenly in the dark was specifically intended to counter the chaos that a night attack could create. The Testudo and other defensive formations were practiced until they could be executed without conscious thought, because in a night attack there was no time for thought. There was only the body, the training, and the sound of the trumpets cutting through the darkness. The Roman military's approach to the relationship between generals and soldiers, the comitus, or accessibility and personal warmth that effective Roman commanders cultivated with their men, is one of the most interesting aspects of Roman military leadership culture and one that distinguishes it sharply from the aristocratic aloofness that characterized some other ancient armies. Julius Caesar was perhaps the supreme practitioner of this art. He knew his centurions by name, fought alongside his men in moments of crisis, shared their physical hardships on campaign, and addressed his soldiers with the word commilitones, fellow soldiers, rather than the more distancing milites. He remembered individual acts of bravery and rewarded them publicly. He also held his men to extraordinary standards and punished failures harshly, but the combination of personal accessibility with genuine capability and success created a loyalty in his soldiers that bordered on devotion. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BCE and began the Civil War, his men followed him not merely because they were soldiers under orders but because they had been with him for 10 years of campaigning in Gaul, had survived things together that created bonds deeper than institutional loyalty and genuinely believed in the man who led them. That quality of leadership, the ability to be simultaneously demanding and personally connected, was what the best Roman commanders shared, and it consistently produced military performance beyond what institutional discipline alone could generate. The Roman military's capacity for rapid fortification, not just the nightly marching camp, but the construction of major permanent fortresses, represents an engineering achievement that shaped the physical landscape of Europe for millennia. A typical Roman legionary fortress, the Castra Stativa, was a massive rectangular installation covering between 40 and 60 acres, housing an entire legion of approximately 5,000 men plus their officers, support staff, and specialist personnel. Within its stone or timber walls, arranged with geometric precision around an internal street grid, were barracks blocks, officers' houses, a headquarters building, granaries capable of storing a year's supply of grain, stables, workshops, a hospital, baths, and the commander's residence, a small palace by any standards. The fortress was not just a military installation, it was the center of a micro-civilization. And it was constructed by the legionaries themselves, working under the direction of military engineers and specialist fabbri. The skill and speed with which a Roman legion could construct such a facility would astonish any modern observer. Legions built their own bases, their own roads, their own bridges, their own hospitals, and their own religious shrines. The Roman legionary was not just a warrior. He was a trained construction worker, engineer, and craftsman. A lethal generalist capable of reshaping the physical environment of any territory Rome chose to occupy. The experience of the Roman legionary at the moment of battle, the actual subjective experience of standing in a line as the enemy approached, is something we can only partially reconstruct from ancient descriptions, but those descriptions are vivid enough to give us a powerful sense of what it felt like. Before the charge, as the enemy army screamed its war cries and pounded its weapons on shields and the earth seemed to vibrate underfoot, experienced soldiers stood still. They had been trained for this moment through years of repetition. Their breathing slowed. Their bodies settled into fighting stances so deeply embedded in muscle memory that conscious thought was almost unnecessary. The man on your left shoulder was close enough to feel his body heat. The man on your right was so near that your shields overlapped. You could smell blood from your own earlier wounds or from the men ahead of you. You could hear the Centurion's voice above the noise, steady and controlled, more concerned perhaps than his face revealed but unwilling to show it. And then the trumpet sounded, the advance, and you moved forward with 20,000 other men at the same moment, and the noise of that advance, the rhythmic crash of thousands of hobnailed sandals on hard ground, was itself a weapon, a physical expression of collective will that could be felt in the chest before it could be heard distinctly. This was the moment that all the training had built toward. This was what it meant to be a legionary of Rome. The Roman military's legacy in the area of military law is as substantial as its legacy in tactics or engineering, though far less celebrated. The ius militare, military law, was a sophisticated body of regulation that covered every aspect of legionary life from the moment of enlistment to the moment of discharge, and in many cases beyond. It specified the rights and obligations of soldiers, the procedures for courts martial, the punishments for various offenses, the entitlements of veterans, and the complex regulations surrounding the property and inheritance rights of men who, as soldiers, were formally prohibited from certain civilian legal activities. Roman military law recognized that the special circumstances of military service required special legal frameworks. Soldiers could not simply be treated as ordinary citizens before ordinary courts. The praefectus castrorum, the camp prefect, the most senior non-commissioned officer of the legion, was responsible for much of the day-to-day legal administration of the unit, including disputes between soldiers, discipline below the level requiring a formal court-martial, and the management of the unit's finances and property. This legal sophistication meant that the Roman army was not merely a collection of armed men but a legally constituted institution within which rights and responsibilities were defined with remarkable precision. Many aspects of Roman military law were absorbed into the later Byzantine military tradition, into medieval codes of chivalry, and ultimately into the uniform code of military justice and similar modern military legal systems. The story of Marcus Cassius Scaeva at the siege of Dyrrhachium in 48 BCE is one of the most astonishing individual accounts of legionary resilience in all of Roman history, and it illustrates the almost superhuman physical endurance that Roman military training could produce. According to Caesar's own account of the Civil War, Scaeva was a centurion who held a fortified position against repeated attacks from forces loyal to Pompey. When his position was finally overrun and he was examined afterward, his shield was found to contain 130 arrow holes. He had lost an eye, been struck in the shoulder and thigh, and still continued fighting. Caesar rewarded him with a promotion, a significant cash prize, and the title of Primus Pilus. Whether the precise details are accurate or embellished for propaganda purposes, Caesar was a brilliant writer who understood the value of specific vivid detail in creating lasting impressions. The account captures something essential about the Roman military ideal. The centurion who held his position beyond the point at which any reasonable calculation of self-preservation would have him retreat was not merely a hero of circumstance. He was the embodiment of everything the Roman military system was designed to produce. A man for whom the oath, the standard, the opinion of his fellows, and the demands of Rudis were more powerful than the body's desperate screaming instinct for self-preservation. The Roman military's role in spreading literacy and Latin across the Western Roman Empire is one of its most significant and least glamorous legacies. Service in the legion required a level of basic literacy that was unusual in the ancient world. Soldiers needed to read orders, sign for equipment, understand the password, and engage with the bureaucratic apparatus of the army. Men who enlisted illiterate were taught to read and write as part of basic training. Over generations, this meant that the Roman military served as an enormous literacy program spread across the empire, producing millions of men who had been taught to read and write Latin regardless of what language they had spoken at home. The Latin these men learned was the Sermo Militaris, military Latin, a simplified, standardized register that prioritized clarity over elegance, and which had an enormous influence on the development of the Romance languages that evolved from Latin after Rome's fall. The writing tablets recovered from Vindolanda and other military sites are full of the slightly rough, pragmatic Latin of real soldiers rather than the polished periods of Cicero, and they are linguistically fascinating precisely for that reason. A man who served 25 years in the Roman military and then retired to a provincial town was, in a very real sense, a vector for Roman language and culture that influenced everyone around him for the rest of his life. The Roman military's use of psychological operations extended even to the equipment and appearance of its soldiers, which were designed, consciously or through evolved convention, to maximize the intimidating visual impact of the legion in both individual and mass terms. The transverse crest of the centurion's helmet, visible above the mass of soldiers, communicated leadership presence in the formation. The distinctive curved rectangular shape of the scutum, painted with lightning bolts, wings, and the specific insignia of the unit, created a visual coherence in the Roman battle line that communicated organization and discipline to observers. The polished metal of armor and helmets, deliberately maintained even on campaign, reflected light in ways that created an impression of wealth and technological superiority. The lockstep precision of the Roman advance, thousands of men moving with the same foot at the same moment, produced not just military coordination but a visual effect that ancient observers consistently described as both beautiful and terrifying, like watching a single enormous organism rather than a collection of individuals. Roman commanders understood this and invested significant effort in maintaining the visual impact of the legion as part of their overall strategy of intimidation. You didn't just fight Rome. You confronted it, and the confrontation was designed to begin breaking your will before the first pilum had been thrown. The long-term fate of the Roman legionary system is a story of gradual transformation rather than sudden collapse, and understanding this helps clarify both the remarkable longevity of Roman military power and the nature of its ultimate decline. The legions of the late Roman Empire, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries c. were very different institutions from the cohort legions of Augustus, which were themselves quite different from the manipular legions of the Republic. The heavy infantry of the Principate gave way progressively to smaller, more mobile units as the empire's strategic problems changed from conquest to defense of an enormous perimeter against increasingly sophisticated adversaries. The barbarian federates who fought under Roman command brought their own equipment, tactics, and loyalties into what was nominally still the Roman army. The pay and conditions of service declined relative to the Augustan period. The institutional culture and the sense of continuous tradition that had sustained the legions through centuries became diluted as recruitment widened and the Roman identity of the army became increasingly nominal. The last Western Roman legion is not documented dissolving or being destroyed. It simply fades from the record, as the institutions that gave it meaning dissolved around it. The Eastern Roman army that continued for another 1,000 years in Byzantium maintained many legionary traditions, but in a transformed context that reflects continuity more than identity with the classical legion. The Roman military's influence on military thinking across the subsequent 2,000 years of European and world history is so pervasive that it is difficult to fully catalogue. The military writings of Vegetius, a 4th century Roman author whose Epitoma Rei Militaris summarized what he understood to be the ideal Roman military system, became the single most read and most influential military text in medieval Europe. Kings, nobles, and military commanders from Charlemagne to the Crusaders to the condottieri of Renaissance Italy read and argued about Vegetius. The organization of armies into hierarchical units with defined command structures, the emphasis on training and discipline over individual heroism, the integration of engineering with combat operations, the understanding that logistics is the foundation of strategy, all of these principles, which feel like basic common sense to modern military thinkers, are Roman in origin and Roman in their most fully realized ancient expression. When early modern European states began building professional standing armies in the 16th and 17th centuries, they explicitly looked to Rome as their model. The pike and musket formations of the Spanish tercios, the drill manuals of Maurice of Nassau, the military reforms of Gustavus Adolphus all drew consciously and explicitly on Roman precedent. The legionary is not merely a historical figure. He is the ancestor of the professional soldier as the world still understands that concept. The final, most human fact about the Roman legionary is perhaps the most important of all, and it is this: he was afraid. No amount of training, no weight of oath, no force of Rudis removed the fear from the man who stood in the front rank as the enemy came screaming toward him across a blood-soaked field in the gray light of a foreign dawn. What training gave him was not the absence of fear but the capacity to function despite it, to keep his shield up, to keep his feet planted, to listen for the trumpet call and respond to it, to trust the man on his left and the man on his right and the centurion shouting behind him that this line would hold because it had always held. The Roman legionary was not a machine. He was a human being who had been given extraordinary tools, physical, psychological, tactical, spiritual, for managing the most terrifying experience a human being can face. He missed his family. He complained about his food. He got sick and he got scared and he got lonely. He gambled and he drank and he fell in love with people he shouldn't have and he wrote letters home asking for socks because the frontier was cold. He was, in all the ways that matter most, like us. And yet what he accomplished, what he and his brothers built and held and fought for across centuries, remains one of the most remarkable achievements in all of human history. 2,000 years have passed since the last Roman legionary laced his sandals, checked the edge on his gladius, and fell into formation under the eagle standard of his legion. And yet the world he helped to build is still, in countless ways, the world we live in. The roads he paved still run through European cities. The laws he enforced evolved into the legal systems that govern modern democracies. The language he spread across a continent gave birth to French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian. The military principles he lived by are still taught in staff colleges from West Point to Sandhurst. The legionary was not a superhero or a demigod. He was a man, ordinary in origin, extraordinary in what he was made to become, who served an idea larger than himself and, in doing so, shaped the idea of civilization itself. 100 facts. 100 windows into a world that was, in the truest sense, the foundation of our own. These men built an empire from a single city. They marched to the edges of the known world and planted the standard of Rome on beaches and mountainsides and desert fortresses that no army had ever reached before. They were brutal and they were brilliant. They were disciplined and they were human. They were, above all else, extraordinary. If this video gave you something, a new perspective, a moment of genuine astonishment, a sense of connection to those men across 2,000 years of time, then please hit that like button because it helps more than you might think. Subscribe to this channel if you want more deep dives into history's most fascinating stories, told the way they deserve to be told, in full, with the detail and the drama that the people who lived them actually experienced. And if you want to keep going right now, there is more waiting for you. The history of the Roman Empire, its greatest battles, its most extraordinary figures, and the world it made and unmade. The march is not over. It never really ends. Stay with us. For the eagle. For Rome. For history.